Okay.
Which is,
Tell us about that, yeah.
varies depending on the jurisdiction you're in. But in South African law, if you possess something openly as if owner for an uninterrupted period of 30 years, it becomes yours. And I suppose you communicating ownership with people using it as if you're an owner, where people actually see it, it's quite public.
And what do you have to kind of do or use in order to communicate that you are as if you are an owner? Okay. Follow the rules.
Because there is actually no registered.
There's no register, right?
It's that's why it takes such a long time. Because strictly speaking, it could have been someone else's property.
Right.
But if you were using it as if owner for 30 years uninterrupted, it would become yours, even if it was someone else's before.
Okay. And what would you do to communicate as if owner?
It's a possession.
Okay.
You're in control of that property. But the thing with prescription that has come up with me, and it's been quite interesting, is that like in informal settlements, you are leasing it from the state. But a lot of the times it's crossing over generations. It's definitely past 30 years. And the perception is that you own it, but you don't. And the shock of that disconnect can be really, really,
it's a really good point. So use it, like you're saying, use it. You built a house or a shack on it. You're there every day or almost every day.
Possession. It's just
you have possession.
Being broken up by this lease that you didn't really even know was over the land.
Right. Yeah.
There was a point there.
Yeah.
We thought of property. So what came to mind was a ring.
Okay.
A ring or someone's ring that presumes that it belongs to someone else. Whatever belonging means, how that is enforced, I guess, by prancing around together. And then another one we thought of was that for land, for example, creating demarcations and putting signs like trespassers will be prosecuted or shot on sight.
Keep out.
So the threat of violence can be a good way to enforce ownership.
Okay, yeah.
I'd go on further and say violence, not even the threat of violence, but actual violence.
Threat or violence.
Kicking people off the property.
Yeah.
We had an interesting exchange about the lecture theatre and how in certain areas of our lecture theatre last year there was like a very specific type of crowd that would stay in that sector, and you would like go sit there all willy-nilly. Like that became their place from first year throughout, and there was like a specific group. And if you were to go sit there, it would be like, what are you doing here?
Right.
And it got even worse because it was a very specific type of person with like all with MacBooks, everyone sitting. Not a person on the front of MacBooks. It was just like there was a very specific character, and going in there with your Lenovo.
Active aggression, actually. So there was yes. Sorry, carry on.
So the thing with the MacBook mafia. Is that they don't explicitly say you can't come here and sit with us, but that ability to have a sign that is perceived by others as you cannot come here is ridiculous. And then I spoke of how I literally had to like save 4 years to get a MacBook to be in the mafia. And then it got me thinking about like general repossessions and like economic failures, because everyone's trying to get a property to fit in or to just own that property for whatever reason.
Sure.
And sometimes it's not within what you're actually able to do, but the things you do to actually become part of a property.
Right. Right. So I think that's a really interesting point. So there's a kind of social agreement, but also an indication of sort of social class and achievement that happens through the acquisition of a MacBook and therefore this part of the classroom, and on a larger scale through the acquisition of a house or a car or something like that. Yeah.
You also spoke about like morality and social norms, because you know when Germans go on holiday and they wake up early in the morning just to put their own towel somewhere at the pool so that everyone knows this is my space now for today at the pool. That's so typical German. And it's so funny because actually like all the chairs at the pool belong to the public or to the hotel.
Right.
So just because you see this towel, you know, like, okay, that's not the chair of the hotel anymore, it's the chair of the person whose towel is there. Yeah,
Right,
the German.
Dibs on that chair.
I went through a similar thing in Kramer. At the bottom there's like a whole bunch of tables, but they're all set, and you know they get folded up quite quickly. And I had a meeting there with a few people, and there was 2 bags on top of like a stretch, the only available table. And I knew what I was doing was like breaking a social contract, but I moved those bags and sat there and started the meeting. And then when they came back to fetch their bags, there was actually a little bit of like tension and anger towards me. And I knew what I'd done was like not right. But at the same time I was like, but if you're not there and someone else needs to use it, like I'm gonna use it. So
Okay.
it's this like awkward tension. Like, I'm gonna move this person's
Okay.
stuff.
Yeah. I saw a hand there.
I just wanted to say to add on to the MacBook thing, that it's not. I don't think it's always just a class thing. I think it's also just like habits. So if you think about maybe people selling various things on street corners that become their street corners, it's about kind of like presence and occupying a space. And I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
I think with the social contract, this is just the assumption that we have that when we see stuff, it belongs to someone. It's the socialization that we've gone through, especially in upper middle class sectors where we just assume, look, I can't see any indication of it being someone's, but my immediate assumption is that it's someone's.
Okay.
Yeah.
We spoke about a lot of incorporeal property, so property that you can't see or touch, that's intangible, and how the reason why it becomes necessary to give certain markers to things like shares or like IP is because the law itself doesn't do enough. So we then work with fictions in order for us to make it work. So we kind of make stuff up like, oh, well, we have this company and we want to make sure that people have a right to this company. How do we make that like a tangible thing? So it seems to be because we're visual creatures, the easiest thing is to say, my book is here, this is my space. But where you have things that you actually can't see, where the space is not tangible, then you have to come up with something else that is tangible to represent your ownership.
Okay, so extension of kind of something tangible to almost act as a sign or symbol for something intangible.
And consensus, like presenting an idea at a conference so that enough people hear you say it, so the next time someone repeats it, they say, no, I think that's Peter's idea.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I've actually put a column on the side here because we're talking about a lot of examples, and I think that there's some underlying principles that seem to govern a lot of the claims we're talking about. So, for instance, the notion that you put your towel down first seems to be based on, to me, on like a claim of first access. So I was here, I got up early, therefore it's mine. Or I reached this land first, so it's mine. And then claims of superiority. So I've got more money, more power, I've got a MacBook. The space is mine, to give the example there. Or occupation, so I keep on using this space. Or consensus, everyone agrees based on a discussion or a vote or something that this is mine. There's some other, I saw some other hands. Yeah, at the back.
Our discussion was just basically touched on description, but also validation in terms of people being able to say
Okay.
that they've seen you occupy that space.
Right.
So that is also important in order to kind of prove.
Really good
Or
point.
research in space in the absence of the deeds or deeds of service.
Right, so I think that's an excellent point because so there's social recognition that's happening. So even without legal recognition, there might be social recognition, which can also enable you to have a fairly powerful hold on property. Of course, that could be all unseated if someone came along and used the law to try and take that away from you. As we'll discuss later, has been the case in the history of dispossession of land of Black South Africans over the last few centuries. Nolundi.
So I'd add another 3. I'd add by affiliation to a particular identity.
Okay. Yes.
Which in part is some of that MacBook Mafia vibe.
Yes.
Through birth.
Okay, yeah, birth.
And sort of and then the third is for me related to birth, which are the spiritual connections that come with birth.
Mm-hmm.
I also didn't
Yeah, all very good points. Other ways in which one can stake and try and prove one's claim. Yeah.
I don't know if it's in your column, but the picture of Chicago, I'm more familiar with Boston, and just occupying or being first doesn't matter. What matters if you worked it, right? In Boston, you can only make that claim if you're the one that dug your car out, because there's a lot of snow to move. And if someone else moves in, they put the chairs there, it doesn't matter, I worked it, you move your car.
Okay, yeah. that is very interesting. So the notion of, well, your labor has won you this right. And if you think about sort of early natural law theories of property, John Locke's idea, if you mix your labor with the land, it becomes yours. So we see that operating in these chairs in the snow principles as well. Yeah.
I think naming things, like putting your name on it. Even in colonial times, they'll name a country after themselves. If I go and just write down labels and I decide to pick up someone else's pen space and I put my name on it, and a dispute arises, people are more likely to say, well, this is your name, so it's yours.
Right. Yeah, good point. Yes?
Personalizing as a form of differentiation. Like, I don't know, you use the example of putting your face on the computer screen to show people that it's yours.
Yeah.
Connected to Nolundi's points,
yes.
Patriarchy would be one. In familiar settings, there's 2 fires. There's one fire that is clearly, so that's one. And also inheritance in certain cultures as the man, you are going to get certain things. And I think some of that also comes more broadly from religion. And the idea that the world is to be owned.
So yeah, very interesting. Religious ideas that the world is to be owned. And your point about patriarchy are maybe linked to ideas of sort of superiority, or I don't know if that's the right term, but the idea that men make better owners of land or household heads or something. Better drivers, whatever. Yeah.
That contrasts with earning it, like working it. So it's sort of unearned privilege, that you haven't done anything to earn it. Just like if you look in a certain, you've got a certain look about you, whether it's class or race or whatever, you can walk in and occupy certain places without anybody challenging you. Whereas if you looked in some other way, you probably would be turned away.
Right, I think that's a good point, and also goes to our discussion earlier, particular values and ideologies. So, and the notion of what earning it means and what labour means. So, as we know, certain kinds of women's labour are often not recognised as labour, like care in the home or something, might not be seen as a form of labour that equates to a kind of ownership over a space. Whereas for men working outside the home, for some people would equate to a form of labour worthy of compensation. So they all kind of tied into each other. So I just want to go through this list, this kind of general list, because the next thing we're going to do is talk more specifically about the history of South Africa, I think some of which Tuto probably covered with you yesterday, but more specifically about, well, how did land become owned in South Africa? How did we come to the current system of the deeds registry, the cadastral system, and who is that system excluded, and who is it included? So we've got a few principles here relating to how things become owned. Violence, or the threat of violence, personalizing or naming, claims based on first access, on superiority or on power over others, on occupation or possession, consensus, social recognition, religious ideas, spiritual connections, birthright, affiliation or membership of a particular group, inheritance, and labor power, which earns one a claim to particular property. So in thinking about the story of how land has become owned in Africa, I wanted to play you a clip from a now late professor of land, Hastings Okothagendo, who's from Kenya originally. And so in this video, he's talking about colonialism in Kenya. But I think that the picture that he paints applies to South Africa and other places as well. It's just loaded.
What the British did here, they did in Australia, they did it in North America, they did it in South Africa. The notion that communities do not own land, because the concept of ownership under British law is private ownership. And therefore they don't understand how a whole community can own. And that if a community owns, they think that individuals have no rights against the community. What we had here was a situation where communities were themselves juridical persons and therefore controlled definite territories, determined access to land in those territories, the function for which that access could be given, and the manner in which property rights were allocated, transferred, redistributed, or otherwise transmitted to future generations. And one of the most important aspects of community land law or indigenous land law is that it protected the rights of the unborn as well as the rights of those who are living. And this is why property could not be sold or transferred outside the group. It could be sold or transferred within the group, but not outside the group, because if you transferred it outside the group, you would be expropriating the rights of future generations, and therefore they would have no sustainable basis for livelihood for that reason. And therefore it was a very developed system of land. The British, of course, could not accept that. If they accepted that, they would not have had the power to allocate land, quote, legally. And therefore the first thing they did was to say, these people don't understand what ownership is. Secondly, they are not capable of controlling land directly. And thirdly, they don't have the technology to develop it. And therefore we are going to expropriate title, give it to settlers, pass laws that would enable the settlers to develop it whichever way they wanted it. And the way they dealt with occupation of communities or indigenous communities in areas that they did not need for purposes of settlement, they put them under trust, because they argued that the natives could not hold land as juridical persons, so they put them under trust. And the trust concept continued up to independence. And in this country now, land which is not registered in individual names is held by county councils as trustees, and that comes from the colonial concept that communities cannot hold land directly. So the notion that ownership means total and exclusive expropriation of all right to land is not one that's known to indigenous law. Indigenous law will allow people to graze on it, others will build on it, others will cultivate it, others will transit over it, and all that is managed through a community hierarchy that starts from the family to the lineage and then to a wider territorial body. So there are very, very clear rights. But you see, you are not going to find that in the literature because the British did not even bother to find out how this was done. They simply assumed that we do not see a sovereign, we don't see private property, we don't see land registries, and therefore these people do not know anything about ownership.
So in this clip, I think Professor Carthagendo is very much speaking to the discussion that we've just had about, he says that the British came in and they didn't see to them what resembled property. Therefore, they assumed, and it was certainly in their interests to assume, because then they could justify taking land if they said, well, this land is not owned, it's not as profitable, it's not as productive, people don't put their labor into it the way that we think they should put their labor into it. Therefore, what they have doesn't qualify as a property right. Or if it does, it doesn't qualify as a property right on an equal level to the kind of property rights that we would like to exercise and that settlers would like to exercise here. So it was often used as a justification under colonialism for dispossession of indigenous peoples. So in the South African context, I suggested reading a chapter, the first chapter of a book by someone called Lindsay Brown, or Braun. And here again, this is an excerpt from the introduction of his book, and it's very similar to the story that Carthagendo describes. So in the introduction, Braun is here quoting Freer, who was a colonial official, and Freer stated, I may here note that I've searched in vain through our colonial South African codes of law without discovering any recognition of native land tenures, other than those invented for the natives by their European rulers and legislators. Had any such really Aboriginal land tenures been found existing with recognized force among the native tribes subdued by or next to the colony, they would hardly fail to have been mentioned in the codes. So here you see another kind of seeing, and this is about seeing it in legal codes. So here the British are saying, Freer specifically is saying, well, I don't see a body of law, either through case law or a code written up which designates and regulates how land should be managed and how it is owned. And because I don't see that, it means people don't have land rights, they don't have codes of law. And of course, Black South Africans had mapping systems, they had ways of managing land, they had codes. Often they were both spatial and social, but they didn't register within the vision of colonial map makers, the kinds of signs that we've often become accustomed to. And I think that this kind of thinking that you saw in that quote above was really pervasive throughout the African continent. And so, as a result, by creating a form of property law, at least initially in South Africa, that served the interests of the white settlers and then the white population, what the government was also doing was performing a kind of social engineering exercise. So, trying to give the illusion that they had sort of hegemonic or total power, a legal system that everyone bought into. But as we know, the majority of people here were excluded from access to that particular legal system of property ownership. And so any knowledge, any forms of property that fell outside of the brackets of this colonial scheme of knowledge were glossed over, were said not to exist. One of the things that Brown describes in his chapter is the intense mapping and kind of technological process that was involved in this social engineering exercise. So he shows how land surveyors, scientists were brought in by the government to conduct the process of drawing up the boundaries, of mapping them out, of having in the deeds registry a title deed for every single transaction that took place of land. For white people, that is. So there were these individual plots of land that were established for white people, and they could be bought, traded, taxed, rent extracted from them, and so on. but black people were excluded from having their land registered. And so they were therefore also excluded from access to the other things that come with registration of land. So access to loans from a bank, to funding, and so on. And so I would argue that was part of the process of compelling black South Africans into working for wages, because it had become so difficult to make a living off the land. So these maps indicate, at the time of the 1930 Land Act on the left, and then later on at the time of the establishment of the Bantustans under apartheid, how all the land that you don't see coloured in was designated for ownership either by the South African government, by white-owned companies, or by white individuals and families. And the rest of the land indicated in the shaded areas and the colourful areas on the right was land that had been set aside, in Nakathagendo's words, kind of in trust for black people. The notion that people couldn't manage land themselves, the state would manage land for them and would allocate rights to people. The story of the forced removals is one that I'm not sure Tutu may have covered with you yesterday, but if we think about Cape Town, quite a well-known story in particular urban areas like District 6, in Joburg and Sophiatown, and these are images of forced removals, both rural and urban, so people who are often living outside of the designated areas that have been set aside for black people under apartheid, and so they were removed and dumped into these Bantustan areas, or in urban areas they were removed and put into areas designated for black people. And part of the process that I just want to point out in the making of the Bantustans, and the kind of ideologies of property rights that were perpetuated through that process, the notion that you'll be in a Bantustan, a place where you do not own land, but you use it as a member of a tribe, like a particular group, like Zulus or Xhosas or Sutus or something like that. Part of that notion came with it the idea that people would be governed by traditional leaders and chiefs. Often these leaders were appointed by the apartheid government and were disputed by people. And in the second part of our seminar, we'll be doing an exercise where that will become important to think about. So this is a quote from another of the articles that I suggested you read on the making of South Africa's property law system. Stuart Wilson, who's at SERI in Joburg, Socioeconomic Rights Institute. So he says, South African property law sets up a hierarchy of property rights. At the top sits ownership, notion of private property, complete control or dominion over a thing, defined as the ability to deal with one's property precisely as one wishes. And so South African property law over the last 100 years or so has created property insiders. In other words, earlier we were talking about dynamics of inclusion and exclusion. So certain people are included within the definition of property owners, those who hold title deeds or who are recognized within other forms of common law rights. Prescription would be included in that. And then property outsiders, those whose land rights or property rights are not recognized legally, but may very well have socially recognized forms of property rights. So, for instance, in many of the former Bantustan areas of South Africa, that land, in general, remains under the ownership of the government of South Africa. And so people there have customary rights, but not registered rights, rights that are registered or recognized in law. And the government has yet to enact a law. They made an attempt, a very poor attempt, in 2010 with the Communal Land Rights Act. But they've yet to enact a law that would officially recognize those rights. So, in other words, we still have, I would argue, in South African property law, a system that includes some, in particular those who already benefited during the apartheid period, while excluding others, many South Africans, especially black South Africans. And so in that sense, our property system continues to perpetuate the historically inherited inequalities that we've inherited from colonialism and apartheid. So the question that I'd like to put to you for the next part of the seminar, and we'll tackle the meat of that during the second part of the seminar, is how do we remedy that? How do we rethink property law in South Africa? How do we remake it? Or how do we adapt it to be more in line with the way that the majority of people practice various kinds of land tenure, various forms of property dynamics that may be socially but not legally recognized? So how do we, in many cases, support the already existing property forms that people have developed historically? So that's the question that I put up here, and it's a question that we could draw also from, we're prompted to ask based on Section 25 of the Constitution, which deals with property. Section 25(6) says, a person or community whose tenure of land is legally insecure as a result of past racially discriminatory laws or practices is entitled, to the extent provided by an Act of Parliament, either to tenure which is legally secure or to comparable redress. And then Section 25(9) says Parliament must enact legislation referred to in subsection 6. And as I said, they've so far failed to do that. So these are the two questions that I've put up, which I'd like us to begin to think about over the next 2 minutes or so, just before we end, and then we'll continue and have a larger discussion when we resume in half an hour. So but I know some of you have to leave us after the next 5 minutes, so just like you to kind of brainstorm, begin to think about this, either through how do we change the law so it reflects people's realities, or how do we kind of massage the law to allow people to make space for the reality of their practices.
Where's your magic ball? Don't forget your magic ball.
Thanks for your contribution.
Aninka.
To those who have to run, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah. So can I usurp the space, as I like to do at the end of these lectures, to say from CLS thank you to Tara. It seems weird halfway through when I know many of us are going to still be here, but just from us for a fascinating lunchtime talk. And we look forward to seeing some of you in my methods class tonight, continuing a conversation in a slightly different way with Tara and Tuto at 5 o'clock, and that's up in the Crim seminar room for those of you that are going to be there. Poor Tara, yes. Well, you know, when you got someone good, you got to make it work, right? So tomorrow we'll be having a conversation hosted by ourselves and DGRU on judges and judicial decision making and the role of the legal profession in making sure that those decisions are good or right or whatever else you'd like to call them. And that will happen in LT3 at the 12 to 1:30 slot again. Again, we're going to have lunch, so if you're planning to come and you haven't yet RSVP'd, if you can, just drop us a line at pbl-cls.uct blah blah blah. That would be great. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Anyone who wants to email me any questions, feel free to do so. I'll put my details back on the board as well.